What is up, true crime fans? This is The Flat Circle. It's me, Chris Ryan, and Jason Concepcion, and we are here to talk about Mindhunter, Season 2, Episodes 6 through 9. So essentially the second half of the second season of Mindhunter. We're going to look at it from the true crime side, from the politics side, from the history side, and just talk about the themes and the way David Fincher, Andrew Dominik, and Carl Franklin told this story. So let's get into it. I'm here with Jason Concepcion, and we are going to talk about the second half of the second season of Mindhunter now.
What a normal show.
Yeah, what a totally not sick, depraved show that makes me feel super great about humanity. This is episodes 6 through 9. So on Monday, Jason and I covered 1 through 5. You can also see that video on YouTube where we did it as The Flat Circle, our sort of true crime endeavor. Our umbrella for all things disgusting in this planet. And so episodes 6 through 9 of Mindhunter Season 2 are largely concerned with the pursuit of, the capturing of, and the interrogation of the Atlanta child murderer, Wayne Williams. But before we even get to that, I guess a little context about the Atlanta child murder. So I think I would go into, I would say I was aware, but not an expert on it. How aware of Atlanta child murders were you going into this?
Pretty aware, unfortunately.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of, people who have looked at this case fall into 3 camps, basically. One is Wayne Williams is good for all of it. 2 is Wayne Williams is good for some of it. And 3 is Wayne Williams didn't do any of it.
Right. And he was eventually convicted of 2 of the 30 murders, I believe it was eventually.
Right.
It was not all children, but a lot of children, 28 children, I believe, and two adults.
That's correct. And police would probably say that they consider him good for like 20 some odd of the victims, but there's certain ones that don't seem to fit. Like there were 2 girls who were killed. One of them was abducted from her home. One of them was like bound with duct tape. Both things are like are details that are kind of like out of the ordinary for whoever the perpetrator is. We think Wayne Williams. On the other hand, like the killing stopped when Wayne went to jail.
And this is also what Jason's sort of alluding to with the idea that what's the MO? What is the profile here? That's kind of like one of the consuming themes of the second half of the season is whether or not real life is adhering to Holden's hypotheses about serial killers.
The profile that doesn't fit the profile. He doesn't fit the profile.
They bring in, and throughout episodes 6 through 9, just a little bit of background, like this episodes 6 through 9 are directed by Carl Franklin, who directed One False Move, who's directed a lot of television. He was on The Watch 2 weeks ago, or a week ago now. And it has a different sort of feel, I think, to the first 5 episodes, which are directed by David Fincher and Andrew Dominik. But it definitely is within the Mindhunter vocabulary, like visual vocabulary. For sure. So it doesn't feel like a different show, although there are some different flourishes. And I think it's good that there are different flourishes because the show really opens up. It's like, for the most part, Mindhunter is like a very like interior, dark, windowless room, overhead light, 2 guys kind of going through files and asking questions. And the high points are an interrogation with an already caught serial killer about their history. The second half of the second season, though, is almost a crime show. Yeah,
it is very much a procedural. And all of a sudden we're outside, and outside in the daytime at times.
Yes. And in a painstakingly recreated 1980 Atlanta. Yeah. And just to give you some idea about what was going on back then, you've got, maybe not the mass media that we're accustomed to now, but there was definitely a lot of attention being paid to crimes like this because there was, Jason and I talked about this a lot on the True Detective episodes that we've done, this idea of stranger danger, this idea of it's 10 p.m., do you know where your kids are?
Just starting to bubble at this time. And really
the collision of Reagan's America and this idea of going back to white picket fences or this idea versus you can't lock your doors. You can't unlock your doors at night. You can't let your kids play outside because you don't know what's going to happen to them. You combine this with Atlanta changing. So earlier in the season, Ford arrives in Atlanta and Hartsfield's becoming one of the biggest airports in the world.
Right.
And Atlanta's got a lot of investment coming in. And what does Atlanta want known about itself? How does it want to be perceived?
Not serial killers.
Yeah, not as a bastion for child murder, obviously. And in 1985, James Baldwin wrote a book called Evidence of Things Not Seen. It was pieces that he was writing for Playboy about the Atlanta child murders, and he said, the state of Georgia had never before exhibited so intense an interest in Black life or Black death. And Holden's interfacing with that phenomenon is kind of a major part of the second season. I think that in some ways the emotional kind of climax of the season is Holden running through this vigil with a cross. And it's probably the most visually like kind of the most virtuosity of the season is lent to that, where they switch footage stocks and they shoot it almost like a 1960s like Zapruder film
Yeah, it
kind
looks
of thing.
like all washed out, and you see the film grain and the transitions.
So let's just talk broadly about how you felt. Like, what did you think of the way that they moved through the Atlanta child murders in this last 4 episodes?
I was really surprised at how tightly they hewed to the actual case. The way Williams was caught, the kind of cat and mouse back and forth, his real arrogance in the way that he handled himself with the authorities. And then, the denouement and him eventually going to jail. All that was very historically accurate.
Yeah.
They caught him the exact same way. He was driving over a bridge. They heard the Atlanta PD heard a splash, and they pulled him over and questioned him. Didn't hold him that night, but eventually did manage to put him away. And all of that is exactly what happened. And I think it's really interesting to kind of like zoom out and think about how this show might continue in further seasons.
Yeah.
Considering how tightly they have maintain the details of this case.
Yeah, there's no Hannibal Lecter moment.
Yeah,
they don't crack him.
Yeah,
and I would highly recommend people who are interested in this. And Jason hit me to this. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution has done a really good job collecting all of the work they've done on the Atlanta child murders over the years, and it's a fascinating like sort of archive to go through both the pieces from the time, like from 1980, and then interviews with Williams 10 years after that.
It continues to this day. The case continues to be looked through because certain victims, as we said before, it's unclear whether he actually is responsible for those deaths. So that the investigation really continues.
And the cases were closed, even though he was only convicted of 2 murders, and that's sort of the end of the season is Holden talking to the mothers in Stop and Camille Bell especially, and talking about whether or not this gesture is justice. So it's like, we got him. I feel really good about the guy we got in terms of like my certainty that he is responsible. Do we have a connection to, can I give you the closure necessary to know that this is what happened to your son? No, I cannot do that.
Right.
So it's the impossibility of closure beyond justice. And Jason and I spent so much time. We talked about this on Monday about like the sort of sign signifier idea of like a lot of law enforcement and a lot of justice things where it's like you think that this is the end, but it doesn't. It's only the end in one arena of life. Yeah. It's not the end for the people who suffered these traumas.
Yes.
And this show really reckons with that.
It really does. And it reckons with it in every strand of the plot. Wendy's love life, Tench's home life, all that stuff feels like it's seeping into everything. And you're kind of forced to contend with the idea that, is it possible that Wayne Williams and BTK are better at compartmentalizing their lives than the
investigators,
normal people who are after them? And it's really an interesting thing to consider. Yeah,
and this show brings up lots of ideas about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the second half of the season, the mother of the toddler that Brian is a party to the death of, if that sentence makes sense, comes to Nancy and is like, I've come here to forgive you because I can't, I think that I've been looking to God for an answer, and I've finally arrived at forgiveness is what I need to give you. And that in itself almost sets off a repulsion in Nancy at her son, who's adopted. And maybe the most searing part of like the entire series so far is Nancy looking, talking to Tench and saying like, every day I wake up and look in the mirror and I know he didn't come from my body, and I'm thankful for that. I was just like, you're just like, okay, I got to go walk into the ocean now.
It's unbelievable. And then her, eventually what she comes to is just escape this.
Yeah.
None of this happened. We're not going to talk to child services anymore. We're just leaving. We're moving.
Yeah.
And whatever that means for the marriage is whatever it means. We're out.
Yeah. And, with Nancy and Tench, I thought it was interesting too, because Mindhunter doesn't go over the top. And you and I like to draw the connections of, if something is set during this time, let's play it out. Like, what would have been in the air culturally at that time? And, Mindhunter does like a nice job here and there with like a KKK member being like, I think the Braves are terrible.
Right.
And Bobby Cox should be fired.
Yeah.
But at that time period, 1980, like, you're not too many years removed from like The Omen.
Yeah.
You're only a few more years removed away from The Exorcist. This idea of like children somehow being vessels of evil was definitely like a thing. I don't, it's not explicit, but I am sure The Exorcist and The Omen are two movies that like David Fincher is high key aware of.
And, the late 60s and 70s was really like a boom time for child psychology, Dr. Spock, like all that stuff was just coming into the popular culture. And you add on to that the fact that Tench is like on the cutting edge of developing these tools to identify behaviors that could signify truly troubled people. And now he has to grapple with the fact that like his alarm bells are going off when he's looking at his son.
Yeah.
And he's hoping that these tools like aren't as good as he thinks they are,
The shot of when Brian's coming out of the school.
Yeah, and he's just
and like all the kids have kind of parted like the Red Sea, and he's just got that look on his face, and then you can just see Tench's face darken as he realizes like there's something wrong with him.
Yeah.
Is pretty chilling. Let's talk a little bit about one of the things I thought was really interesting about the way that they construct these episodes is in a lot of procedurals, especially if you've watched a bunch of them, you wind up kind of being like, I know the ropes.
Right.
Like I kind of know, here's the episode of Law and Order. There's going to be a guy who looks nailed on as the killer, and but obviously it's just he's not. His alibi sticks, or he dies before they, like something happens. Like you said before, they're obviously adhering to history with Mindhunter, but I thought that each of the people that they bring in for questioning, the plumber and the KKK member before they get to Wayne, even much to Holden's chagrin, because he's just insistent that there's no way that the killer would have crossed racial lines. And that there's no way a white killer could go undetected in Atlanta, even though Jim eventually is like, you know what the fuck you're talking about.
Yeah, you don't.
Like
you're not
Atlanta,
from here. You're
Atlanta
not from
is
here.
not Baltimore.
Yeah.
Atlanta's different. It's more mixed. There's more intermingling. But I thought each of those guys who they bring in serves as like a really like almost like a census of the South at the time. Like the plumber who's just kind of like, I'm just trying to keep my head down. Just trying to do my thing. I don't really care who I work for.
I know that the KKK exists, but I was raised differently. I don't
not to hate anybody. And then the KKK guy is like, I'm for sure a racist piece of garbage.
Right. And also there are a lot like me and probably in positions of power. And guess what? You're never putting me away.
Right. But I didn't kill this kid.
But I didn't kill him.
Yeah. And then when they finally come across Wayne on the bridge that night, the thing that Wayne has, that Kemper had, that a lot of these guys have, is it does adhere to Holden's ideas about these killers, and that there is a fascination with the investigation of him, and there's a fascination with the possibility of getting caught.
Yeah.
And like that, all that stuff with Wayne is so electric.
Yeah, there's that moment at, I think it's the end of episode 5 when they first, or episode 6 when they first show up in Atlanta. And
so 5's Manson, 6 they go to Atlanta.
And then the press shows up and they're running around, and you have Wayne. That's our first introduction to Wayne is in that moment.
Yeah.
He steps out of a car with his camera. And then the moment on the bridge really is like, I got an absolute chill, the camera drawing in on him. I was fascinated with, the first interrogation in the car in the next episode, when they're asking him, about do you know any connection to these kids? He's like, I'm not. And the derision with which he spoke about them, and you get that first hint of his real arrogance, and maybe a hint of what the motive might possibly be. That stuff was absolutely electric.
Yeah, and then again, it's like what this show does so well is it looks at behavior, it looks at like someone's life, and then it's like, you know what? If you stand 2 feet to the left and like kick the tires a little hard, you can start to bend things towards narratives.
Yes.
And that's why, you know, like a majority of the people in the task force that's working on the Atlanta child murders is like, it's the Klan.
Yeah.
It's the South. The people who kill black kids in the South are the Klan. They've been doing it for years. We should be looking at the Klan. And Holden is just dead set on it cannot be that, because that's not what my intuition tells me and what my research tells me. And you just wind up seeing, like with Wayne, it's like when you start investigating Wayne, you're just like, well, yeah, like obviously it had to be this guy.
Right.
Like this guy obviously wants to get caught. When they go to the studio and talk to the dude who's like cleaning up at the studio, and he's just like, yeah, he's got a temper.
Yeah.
And he always would be railing about these kids and stuff. And there's obviously like an undercurrent about child prostitution going on in Atlanta, where Holden goes up to the kid and tries to give him money for the arcade.
Right,
And the
and he
kid's
just
like,
runs away.
what do you want for
Right,
this?
yeah.
And he's like, well, what do you mean? What do I want for it? And then he runs away. It's just like, they do so much show, not tell on this show.
Oh yeah.
And they play around with our ideas about what we expect from a show like this. And even things like the bad news relay that I've always talked about, like with like in Broadchurch, where like they essentially will dedicate like 15 minutes of an episode just so you can get to the point where someone gets bad news. It's like in Saving Private Ryan is a better example of like the huge sequence of Saving Private Ryan that is just the mother seeing the car coming up the driveway to give her the news about her sons. And it's like a building and building and building, and it's John Williams music. That never happens in Mindhunter.
It's a great point. There's so much of like stymieing the forward momentum. You know, all these dead ends, whether it be the plumber, the KKK guy, the good idea to put the crosses out at the march, hopefully to draw the killer in, gets stymied. The trying to find the killer, identify him at the concert with Frank Sinatra and
Sammy Davis Jr.
And Sammy Davis Jr. doesn't work. All these different things, and then finally, okay, I guess the bridges, like, and the way that kind of just unfolds, like all of a sudden, without anybody expecting it to, is just like so vibrant, and you get a chill when you just hear it. Like, I love the way the audio cue is like their tension and Holden are talking, and then it's almost like in the background, I heard a splash.
Yeah.
You barely hear it,
Yeah.
and then everything just keys in on, is there a car? Like, let's pull out and try and get him. And it's just, things start happening so quickly, and I was just on the edge of my seat.
It's like they can't believe that after 6 weeks or however long they've been out there, sitting up through the middle of the night, sleeping all day, getting eaten alive by mosquitoes and eating fast food, that on the last night, at the last moment, on the last shift, this guy drives across the bridge.
Yeah.
Like he is basically saying like, okay, I don't want you guys to go without knowing it was me. Let's talk about a couple of different things here. I wanted to ask a little bit about what you felt like. Did you feel like the show changed visually a little bit once Franklin takes over in the second half of the season?
Oh, for sure. I mean, like, you know, the march, I think, is the march and Holden's race to put the cross out, I think, is the most obvious example. It just opened up. All of a sudden, we're brighter.
So that was a moment where I was like, this is so symbolic, I don't even know what it symbolizes.
Right.
Because you've got like a white guy running through a predominantly black vigil holding a cross.
Shots of him in the foreground, the marchers in the background approaching him, everything in focus.
Yeah, and then there's like all these cutaways where it looks like 8mm or 16mm grainy handheld footage that almost looks like this Zapruder film. I thought maybe we were supposed to consider it as, you know, these murders and these killings are sort of seen as these discrete events and they can be studied and analyzed by places like BSU, but they're actually part of a larger wave of history and like the civil rights movement and Atlanta's place as this land of like constant change. What did you think was like sort of the significance of changing the film stock at that moment though?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. I think it's just, you know, the idea of here is the moment where this investigation bursts into the public view, the public of Atlanta.
And that people would have been filming him.
They would have seen it. They would have seen this man running through the streets with a cross and been like, what is this? Who is this person? So this kind of like interconnection where, the shadows come into the light, all these kind of like cutting edge ideas about behavior and where that meets with traditional police investigation, where that meets with civil rights and local politics, and all that stuff in that moment meeting in the broad daylight in one moment.
Yeah, and then there's the idea that, I mean, because you're already dealing with Brian having put that kid on the cross to bring him back to life in Tench's life. The idea that maybe like Holden's running around with this cross, but like the kids are gone. Like there's no one even to bring back. There's no resurrection to happen because there's this absence of a closing chapter to their stories in a lot of ways.
How devastating was that moment when they're assembling the crosses ahead of the march, and
they get him in the boxes.
They got him in the boxes, and one's on the ground, and Tench is just staring at it.
Yeah,
and this pall comes over his face, like, oh man.
Let's talk a little bit about Tench and Wendy's lives, because Holden's largely taken out of it. Holden and his relationship to Debbie was kind of the personal element of the first season, and then aside from his brief flirtation with Tanya at the Omni Hotel,
extremely brief
in Atlanta. Yeah. He doesn't really have like a personal life per se. And I think that, Allison Herman commented a little bit about like, I don't think that he's supposed to have a personal life. Like he doesn't really seem to be a well-rounded person. But Wendy's got this relationship with Kay that has it mirrors Holden's relationship with Debbie to some extent. Mm-hmm. And then Tench obviously is dealing with the evil at home and also the inability to sort of sustain an active like political side of his work life where he's like negotiating for like more power at BSU and getting BSU more funds, but then also like being at home. And then when he is at home, he obviously seems just catatonic.
Yeah. I thought it was part of what makes it so heartbreaking is, Tench too late realizing how dire his marriage and home life is becoming, starts making an effort, taking Brian out to ice cream.
Yeah. Trying to tell him stories about going fishing and stuff like that.
That moment in the backyard where he's showing him how to cook hamburgers and stuff.
Yeah.
And, Wendy has a look of satisfaction, like, oh, this is what it should be always about, on her face. And then the phone rings and he's got to go again. I think, this is a theme that Fincher really seems to like, which is uber competent, driven people who throw everything into a pursuit at the cost of everything personal and dear to them.
Yeah.
And it's really affecting, man. When Tench comes home, first when he calls home and there's no answer,
Yeah.
And then when he gets home and it's just empty,
I can't remember if that's the Marianne Faithfull song playing or if that is Peter Gabriel that's playing when he comes home and you're just like, oh no.
And, there were rumblings, Nancy had said we should move previously. And then there was that moment before that where she was like, we should just get rid of this couch.
Yeah. And she leaves the couch for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because she's like, this was the couch that we had when we moved here. Wendy's relationship to Kay, which ends kind of with Wendy, she overhears Kay talking about how, oh, the person who's upstairs isn't that important. It's not that important that my son meet him. And she's trying to tell her ex-husband, like, yeah, don't worry about it. It's just a fling. We don't have to introduce the kid to her. And then Wendy's kind of like, you can't lecture me about being honest, because Wendy's obviously gone back into the closet when she moves to Quantico from Boston. I thought, like, deciding who the public self is versus the private self was really what Wendy's story was, because that's the conversation she's having also with Henley in Texas and with the killer in New York City when they go and talk to him about all the murders in the gay bars that he was possibly a part of.
Yeah, Wendy
Bateson, I think was the name of the guy.
Paul Bateson, who by the way is in The Exorcist, the real guy.
Seriously?
Yeah, the scene where Reagan has first started to have the incidents and they take her to the doctor and then the radiologist does the thing on her. That is the real Paul Bateson.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
He was in The Exorcist?
He's in The Exorcist.
Holy shit. That's disturbing.
Yes. Wendy really has an issue. Agency is really important to her. And the fact that she's had to go into the closet has made agency in the rest of her life, like really important. She doesn't want to get reassigned. In her, she doesn't want to get reassigned from BSU. When she's in her relationship, she'd like the person to move in, but on her weird, like very vague.
Yeah, you can have the guest room.
Very vague terms.
You're my roommate. Yeah.
Don't wear the heels because I'm wearing flats. Like, it's all these things that are like, just let me be in control because I'm not in control of this one aspect of my life.
And they ask, I mean, that's the same thing that happens to her in BSU is she's starting to become like a burgeoning interrogator and a field officer. And Gunn is like, just stay in the basement, write curriculum, analyze transcripts, come up with these profiles. I don't want you out in the field talking to Henley.
Right.
And we don't even know, is that retribution for her not going home with the guy who was offering to fund the BSU from DC. So I'll be really curious to see where they take these characters personally.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the future of Mindhunter. I'm going to go out on a limb, although I don't know, and say that they'll probably keep making the show for as long as David Fincher wants to make it. It's definitely... I think it's one of the most interesting television shows on right now.
Extremely interesting.
They've talked about how Fincher had a 5-year plan for it. Currently, Fincher's making a movie called Mank, which is about the screenwriter of Citizen Kane. He's making, I believe, for Netflix. He's shooting it in black and white. I think his father wrote the script.
Holy shit.
But, one would assume that they would get back to work on Mindhunter. There was a 2-year gap, I guess, between season 1 and season 2. Where do you think this goes? I mean, we've speculated about the other serial killers it could investigate, but where do you think it goes sort of thematically from here in 1980?
Well, there's a bunch of serial killers who were active at the time. I can't stop thinking about just what an interesting show this is from the sense of it's not like a normal procedural where there's closure and they close the case and everybody feels good. BTK, as we've noted before, doesn't get caught till like 2005.
Right.
That's, 2.5 decades from where we are right now in the story. So that payoff is a long way off.
Yes.
And you're talking about Green River Killer active during this time, Dahmer, Golden State Killer. I think, and that's the kind of thing that really leads me to the idea that this is like less a show. It's less a procedural in that sense and more like a la Zodiac, a show about violence, obsession, and ritual and how that affects people.
Yeah.
So, they can do that for as long as you said, as long as Fincher wants to do it. Where do you think they can?
It's hard for me to believe that they've dedicated, even though he's only in the beginning and ends of episodes, it's hard for me to believe that they've dedicated this much time to BTK without a larger plan towards addressing his case head on.
Yeah.
Now, on one hand, you could say that those interstitials are supposed to illustrate the actual acts and the sort of preamble to those acts that they're investigating on the show. I also think it's supposed to suggest the impossibility of ever actually stopping these people.
Right.
Because out there in like not the wilds of Kansas, but just for the sake of conversation, like the wilderness.
Yeah.
You just don't know what people are doing.
Yeah.
You just don't know whether the guy in the van at the end of the street is a guy taking a nap and eating a sandwich or something much more sinister.
I mean, statistically, these kind of crimes are really rare, but they are pretty persistent in the fact that they do happen and they do exist. I was reading an article recently about how right now is the lowest incidence of serial murders in America since they've started studying it, which either means great, these people aren't around, or
what's taking its place.
Or they're very good at what they're doing.
Right.
Now. So, it's just it is a very eerie subject to think about.
Yeah, and then there's the practical concerns, like how long do you have so Tension and Ford are based on real people, but I think that they're taking liberties with these characters' personal lives and with their movements. Could you feasibly have these guys working as hard as they are, I guess, in it's hard to imagine the Tench character in 2005
Right.
still being alive, frankly.
Right.
Or at least being an active FBI agent.
You know what's fascinating to think is like, say the show goes into the 90s, like what do our BSU agents think of Silence of the Lambs when it comes out? You're like, what is what is their reaction to that?
Yeah, the popularization of the thing that they sort of discovered is fascinating to think of. It's also like, it's obviously like an expensive show to make. I mean, in terms of, it looks expensive to make. The attention to detail, like we talked about before, is immersive but not showy.
Yeah.
So you're in the Omni Hotel and you get to see this indoor mall that's in the hotel itself, but it's not like Stranger Things where they're like, oh, and we're in the mall. Let's go to the frozen yogurt place. It's like, no, there's an arcade. The arcade is one of the only safe places for Atlanta's kids to go after school that isn't like being on the streets. So they come into the arcade and they just kill time until it's time to go home. The construction of those, the recreation of that environment is breathtaking. So yeah, Mindhunter, man, I think it's one of the best things that's come out this year. It's definitely going to haunt me for a long time. And I definitely
haunting.
It really stands up to repeat viewing. So I would just say that if you've watched it, or if you're watching one, but are just listening to this and thinking about it, like, it's really something it is like a great film. You can go back to it over and over again and study different shots. Was there any other stuff you want to talk about with Mindhunter?
Just how smart those scenes where Tench is regaling people with
the FBI stuff.
With the stories of BSU, what Manson is like, what Kemper is like, the way he's able to use that as currency in his various conversations with the child services people. And it gives you this idea, it's really a commentary on how fascinated we are by this stuff.
Yeah, like, and he's the salesman.
Yeah, we don't. These are horrifying crimes committed by like horrifying nightmare people, and yet like we want to know about it. What are those people like? What was it like to sit next to them? Like what and it's a real commentary on like why we watch this show.
Yeah, because I think and one of the fascinating conversations that comes out of the Atlanta child murders is whether or not like this killer is separated from some sort of ideology,
right?
And whether or not this guy is an extension of the racist attitudes of the South at times, or whether or not he is a black predator, preying like hunting black kids. And now we live in a time that's like hyper ideology is informing a lot of crime in terms of our interpretation of it, and obviously in terms of the motivations behind it. So it hardly am I looking at like the 80s with like this like time of like through rose-colored glasses, but they are different eras when you think about our relationship to crime. And also like I think the ability people had to be like, that can't happen here.
Right.
I mean, I was talking with a old coworker of ours, Rembert Brown, and he was like, I remember, like, I wasn't really allowed to, like, go outside for periods of time growing up in Atlanta because of this. And I'm sure you and I both have stories in Philly and in New York about times where we weren't allowed to do the normal everyday kid shit where you go outside and ride your bike all day and don't check in. Like, that's the thing that, like, I always think about with True Detective is just, like, you would leave your house at 10 a.m. and come back at 7.
Right.
And, like, that was just, you were off the grid.
You're just off the grid.
So
you might get to a payphone and call, but probably not.
And they might be home when you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was just like that idea of being unreachable, and that you're just kind of like going along on this social contract that your child can go outside and be safe, that you could go out into the world and just kind of go about your day. And then you see a scene, and this is probably the most chilling scene in the entire show to me. It's the fucking scene of the BTK guy making Xerox copies of his drawings and poetry.
Yeah.
And you're just like, dude, like, who hasn't been in the library next to a weird guy, And that is the freakiest part about it. And it's the thing that this show gets so well is like how this stuff can breed fear.
Yes.
All right. Thanks so much for watching and listening to us talk about Mindhunter this week. Really appreciate you checking us out.